Hello, everyone. This is Nayiri from Low Carb and Fasting. Now, for those of you who are familiar with the channel, you will have noticed that the guests that I invite to the channel all have a personal story that we can resonate with. Actually, most of the stories are the classic tale of the protagonist experiencing great misfortune, and then with resolve and equally great conviction, they managed to turn their, and hard work, they managed to turn their outcomes around. And they emerge as the winners, as heroes or heroines. So today's guest is one such hero from Massachusetts, and you will love his personal story. Dr. Kevin Gendreau, welcome to Low Carb and Fasting.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it so much. It's great to be here.
It's great to have you, and I can't wait to hear your story, your personal story, one more time. I've heard it. I've listened to all your podcasts before. But can you just briefly tell us where you studied and what did you specialize in?
Sure. So for undergrad, I went to Boston University in Boston, Massachusetts. For medical school, I was at Lewis Katz School of Medicine. It's Temple University School of Medicine in Philadelphia. And then for residency, I went back to Boston for Tufts for family medicine residency. And then later in February of 2020, I applied for certification, board certification in obesity medicine by the American Board of Obesity Medicine. So I'm both family medicine certified and obesity medicine certified. And right now I'm working full-time as a weight loss physician, medical weight loss.
So you're a board certified doctor, but you're also an author. So not only metaphorically speaking, you wrote your own story, but also you were an actual author of a book on fasting, and you also write children's stories.
I do, yeah. I actually, I got into writing just with creative writing with children's books. I love kids. I'm very close to my niece and nephew, and I kind of wanted to put my passion for creative writing to print. And back in medical school in 2012, I published my first children's book, which is it was a healthy living book for kids called A Healthier You with Sophia and Sue. And Sophia is my niece who was recently born at the time and was so excited to star in a children's book. And then more recently in 2018, actually before the COVID-19 pandemic, I wrote a book titled Queen Celine's Vaccine Machine. And that's just a little adventure book for kids about why we give vaccines and what are kind of the diseases that are being prevented, but it's told in sort of a whimsical adventure story.
Wonderful. And I love the photos of your niece that you post on Instagram and Twitter as well. I've seen them on Twitter. Dr. Gendreau, let's start with your personal story. So you were specialized in obesity medicine, and yet you were obese yourself.
Actually, yeah. So the specialty in obesity medicine came later. I decided to do that at a later time after I lost all my weight. So I was a physician and I was board certified and I was practicing, but I was in family medicine at the time.
So how
interesting story.
When did you become obese? When did you and what happened?
Yeah, it was kind of a very slow, insidious process, honestly. So as a child, I was pretty much a normal weight and I was very active, ate a fairly balanced diet. I like to hike and I like to fish and I was pretty active, didn't really have a weight problem. I went away to college at Boston University at age 17 and everyone else was gaining the freshman 15 and I slowly but surely put on the freshman 50 because at the time my father had just been diagnosed with metastatic melanoma. So he had skin cancer that was first discovered on his upper back. It was just like a mole that didn't really look too good. And with every subsequent doctor's appointment, with every surgery he was scheduled for, chemotherapy treatment, radiation, it was kind of just like a progressively worsening situation. And so we got bad news after bad news. And that's, you know, in my 17, 18th year, I was starting to associate negative news about you know, my loved one with, let me use food in order to cope. So I started to develop this terrible relationship to food. And it was particularly hyper palatable, addictive kind of foods like chips and cookies and cereal and juice and chocolate milk and things like that. So slowly but surely over the course of his treatment and his passing during my college years, I put on that 50 pounds. And then when I went to medical school, things slowly worsened and I gained another 50, 60 pounds. That was probably just because I had never really fully grieved my father or coped with his passing, but also just the rigors of being a medical student and being up late every night and studying late hours. And so you kind of just do what's convenient when it comes to food, and what's convenient also tasted good, also satisfied my dopamine and serotonin receptors. And that was all of that, you know, hyper palatable, heavily processed carbohydrates and sugar. And then I went and became a resident in family medicine. And that's when the rest of my excess weight came on. And I ended up topping out at 306 pounds and being diagnosed with type 2 diabetes and hypertension, high cholesterol, obstructive sleep apnea, fatty liver, plantar fasciitis, depression. I mean, so many obesity linked comorbid conditions. And so I was a practicing physician seeing patients in clinic at 306 pounds and giving advice about, you know, weight loss and wellness and nutrition, being that size, which is that was very awkward practicing.
So how old were you diagnosed with all these conditions?
That was at age 27. So it was before I even turned 30 that I had all of these conditions. It's because I have such a strong family history of all of those conditions, all of the above. I mean, when it comes to like my father's side of the family and then my grandparents, pretty much everything from diabetes to heart disease and cancer all runs in my family pretty strongly. So I was like genetically predisposed. And so I was adding fuel to the fire by eating all of these horribly processed foods.
And then something else happened, which made things worse. Tell us about that.
Yes. So when I was 27, my older sister, who was 31 at the time with two small children, was unfortunately diagnosed with a rare form of ovarian cancer called a germ cell tumor. And it arose extragonadally, meaning it didn't actually start in her ovary. It started elsewhere in her pubic area. And it was an extremely aggressive cancer. And so she underwent surgery and radiation, stem cell transplants, actually multiple surgeries, chemotherapy. She got her treatment through Dana-Farber, and it was a quite agonizing 18 months of her fighting to survive for her two children. And in the process of seeing my sister go through that, I decided to choose differently with my health. And I largely started to view my nutrition decisions every day as a choice to be unhealthy. And I think that that's what really reframed my whole thought process, because here's my sister, given this fate, no choice of her own, has to just endure whatever treatment they throw at her, has to try like hell and fight like hell to survive for her kids. And I'm like choosing to stuff cookies and cereal and bread in my face every day. And so once I reframed it as like, I'm choosing this life, I'm choosing to be sick, I'm choosing to have diabetes and high blood pressure, I realized like I need to be well for these children to help be there for them. And committed to a low carb diet. And then the whole, fasting thing came later on in the process, but I lost 70 pounds with low carb. And then the remaining 50 pounds or so with fasting, intermittent fasting.
And that's why we've invited you to our channel, Low Carb and Fasting. And you fit the frame, you fit our frame. So tell us about your book. Your book is, the title is Fasting While Furious: How I Turned Anger and Sadness into Motivation for weight loss. Tell us more about the book. When did it come
Yeah.
out? I think it was quite recent, right?
It's about 1 year ago. I think it was last June. So it's been like 13 months. And it's not a very long book. It's like a quick read. It's $9.99 on Amazon. And in it, I share basically my story of how I gained all of this weight, down to the nitty-gritty details, and then how I came to that realization that I was just discussing, with viewing and reframing my nutritional habits as a choice and then choosing differently. And so it's kind of my motivation and inspiration to lose all of the weight and what my life looked like, from childhood all the way to adulthood, getting board certified, and then losing all of this weight. So it's really more like an autobiographical journey, but there are some parts of the book that can help people start on this whole low carb and fasting journey themselves. And so there's a chapter about getting started. There's a chapter about some supplements that might be marketed out there. There's a sample meal plan that's like a 7-day meal plan that's planned out on an intermittent fasting schedule. And so it can be used a little bit as like a getting started guide or like a door opening into the world of low carb and fasting.
So as an obesity physician now, you do use low carbohydrate diet and fasting as an intervention with your patients?
I do. I would say the default that I use between like low carb and fasting is definitely low carb. Like I focus our first visit so heavily on decreasing, minimizing, avoiding, limiting, eliminating processed carbs and sugar, because that's the main problem when it comes to, I think, weight gain in this country is just this hormonal link between the types of foods that we're eating and slow but sure weight gain over time. So I go over low carb as kind of like a default nutrition plan. And then I pick usually different carb counts depending on the person sitting in front of me. So if I have someone who's vegan, they might have a slightly higher carb count, like 60 to 80 grams of total carbs a day. And then I have someone who's more on the carnivore side where they're like not really interested in vegetables. They may be eating 10 or 20 grams of carbs per day. But the overall theme is carb restriction, because we know that that's linked to improvements in triglycerides and hemoglobin A1C. I know you're diabetic yourself, although a lot different than my patients since you're type 1, but it can benefit. I mean, it can benefit anybody with diabetes. So
following the keto diet now, so mainly carnivore, animal-based products, meat, eggs, etc., with small amounts of vegetables. It's working like magic for me. So just having stable blood sugars pretty much every day, apart from when there are other variables playing a role, like that time of the month or physical activity. But even that, because I wear a pump and a CGM.
Yep.
I'm able to, tweak things here and there and just prevent hypos and prevent hypers. Just a little advice from me, if you don't mind, for anyone who's type 1 out there. You may not find that perfect recipe. I mean, I haven't found the perfect recipe myself, because there isn't a perfect formula that you can stick to every single day and you'll be fine. You're never going to have highs or lows. But being on a low carbohydrate diet, as Dr. Bernstein says in his book, The Diabetes Solution, Dr. Richard Bernstein, he says, if you are on a low carbohydrate diet, well, high or moderate protein, your fluctuations, your blood sugar fluctuations will be minimal. You won't avoid them. They will be minimal. So
that's the idea.
I don't know why we haven't implemented that as a...
I know. It took until 2019 for the ADA, the American Diabetes Association, to kind of endorse low carb as an option. But even then, it's not really fully fleshed out. It's not the standard dietary intervention, and it's not really carb reduction to a point of 40 or 50 grams a day. It's more like 120. So it's kind of like not all the way there.
No, and it's only presented as an
option rather than like the default meal plan.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But I mean, there are so many, various ways to implement it. Like if you are carnivore, if you are vegan, if you do like say Whole30 or paleo, or even people on Weight Watchers, I know it's all about points, but there are commonalities between like staying low carb and these things. You just have to kind of find them, like create a Mediterranean low carb diet, or follow your Weight Watchers and your points, but just know that like overall we're doing a huge reduction in the carbs and you're focusing more on protein, fat, and fiber than anything else.
Especially the processed carbs. I mean, they've got to go.
I know. It's such a problem. And even, I mean, there's people who are hospitalized with diabetes and the hospital's giving them bread and pasta and rice, and it's so crazy to me. I mean, like knowing what I know about how our bodies respond to these foods in terms of a spike in glucose and then a subsequent spike in insulin, our own endogenous insulin. Like, we don't want these widely fluctuating glucose and insulin levels, because that's what makes you so hungry and craving more carbs and sugar. So it's a problem. And I go over this kind of stuff with like the first time I meet a patient. So it's like important for me to tell them, it's not about calories and it's not about points. It's more about hormones than anything else, including insulin and leptin and ghrelin, the hunger hormone. And I try to teach people about that stuff because they've never really heard it. They've heard calories and low fat forever, and it's never worked. And the more you restrict your calories, the lower your basal metabolic rate goes. Your metabolism's like slowing to meet your lower calorie goals.
Yeah.
And then fasting. I do bring it up. I use fasting as more like an added intervention with low carb. So like low carb's the first default dietary intervention, and then at a later time, if appropriate, if the person has no history of disordered eating, they're not pregnant or breastfeeding, like there's like a list in my head that I go through, active chemotherapy, then they can try intermittent fasting as like an added intervention. I think because I wrote a book titled Fasting While Furious, people think they walk into my office and they're like, I'm already fasting. And I'm like, actually, the most important thing to do first is to lower the carb count. And then fasting will be so easy. It like comes naturally later because you're less hungry.
Exactly. It comes naturally if you are on a restricted carbohydrate diet. I mean, it would have been, I mean, I know I was on a high carb diet because for decades, I've been that type 1 now for 44 years. But we were always told there's no reason to avoid anything because you're diabetic. Eat your carbs and match your insulin to your carbs, which of course is a protocol that simply doesn't work. And but I remember the hunger, the need to eat every 2 hours, because my blood sugar would go up after that pizza or pasta. It would literally shoot up to dangerously high levels. Yep. Despite taking insulin up front, later on, during eating, no strategy would work. And then as blood sugar's dropping down, I would get that feeling of hunger again. And you can't fight it. You can't fight. It's a feeling you cannot fight. So I would eat again and eat again. So all day long, fasting would have been completely unimaginable. If you
I think most doctors, if you told them you were going to fast as a diabetic, they would freak out. I mean, like still to this day, it's so hard. I mean, it's like hard to change minds. I'm glad we have, the Society of Metabolic Health Practitioners. I'm glad we have obesity specialists who are now starting to understand the benefits, but it's true that, I've had endocrinologists and cardiologists call me upset that I mentioned intermittent fasting to their patients. And I'm like, let me just explain to you how simple this really is and like how it doesn't take that much to learn. I mean, I'm not telling people to fast for 5 days who are type 1 diabetic. You know what I mean? Like, I don't want to cause a problem with their blood sugars. I don't want them to get too low. And I've also had issues with like dietitians and nutritionists and personal trainers and chiropractors and people calling me saying that I'm, demonizing food groups and like certain foods. And it's like, people can listen to their own bodies when it comes to these foods, right? Like the way you feel when you're like jonesing for a cookie, that is not like a healthy response to a food. Like that's like an addict responding to a food. So if you reframe it like you're addicted to certain things, I think it really helps people understand, and it helps like people's significant others really understand what they're going through if they do have like binge eating disorder or food addiction issues.
So let's talk about food addiction. So some of your patients, maybe even most, probably have food addiction issue. How do you deal with it?
Yeah, I talk about this in my book a little bit about my own food addiction issues, because I really think it is so similar in the brain to drug and alcohol addiction. And yet, humans need food, whereas we don't need these drugs or alcohol. So food is always going to be around. However, certain food types don't always have to be around, and certain food groups don't have to always be around. So just because we need food to survive doesn't mean we have to hide, goldfish and Oreos and sugary cereals and crackers and bread in all of our pantries and cabinets and refrigerators. That would be like an alcoholic coming home to a pantry and fridge full of nips and beer and wine and everything else. So why do we do this to ourselves? I just don't understand. So it's true that many of my patients do. I would say it's probably, not all of them, but more than half will, have a history of some kind of inappropriate relationship with food, whether it's like a binge eating issue or an inappropriate kind of emotional attachment where they get so much comfort from foods. But I think having so many around in the house and being exposed to them all of the time, like walking by them every time you're in the kitchen, is just like a recipe for failure. It's like asking an alcoholic to walk by nips every day. It's too much. So I go over that and I try to tell people I don't want to demonize these foods, but for most people who are coming to see me, it is the right thing to probably get them out of the home, because it'll just minimize your chance of kind of relapse, relapsing onto them and triggering this chemical dependency all over again.
Mm-hmm. Having these sort of tempting foods all around you in the house is a recipe for disaster, as you said, because and maybe that's why people say, well, the keto diet or low carb is not sustainable. Well, it's not. You're not going to sustain it for more than a day. I wouldn't be able to. If I fed myself constantly on food-like substances and high carbohydrate processed carbs, I wouldn't be able to resist that temptation. So of course I wouldn't be able to sustain the low carb diet. But people just tell me, oh, for 7 years, how did you sustain it? Well, no problem. I have a healthy, I think you mentioned it, and you're so right. To have a healthy relationship with food is important. Well, to have a healthy relationship with healthy foods. I don't restrict calories. I don't restrict my portions. I have no weight issues, and I have no issues with my diabetes or diabetes related complications either.
Exactly. I think portions have to be restricted and calories have to be restricted if pizza and meatball subs are going to be in your day-to-day life, because you have no choice but to eat smaller portions of those foods. But it's almost like torture eating smaller amounts of those things because they're so hyper palatable that you want them so badly that it's like you're torturing yourself every time you're on a diet, if that's how you diet. But if you switch to protein, fat, and fiber as your primary source and you got rid of the starches and the carbs and the sugars, you would just be so much more likely to stop when you're full. This whole intuitive eating movement is so much easier when you don't have carbs and sugar and starches. I think intuitive eating, if I'm actively eating Oreos, my intuition is do not stop eating these, do not stop. Of course, they're so delicious. You eat them until you're gonna throw up. You can't help yourself. I mean, not everybody is like that. Not everyone has this addicting food, binge eating kind of personality, but that's how it is for me. So intuitive eating will never work if hyperpalatable foods are in my life, but it can, and I can, be very mindful of when I'm full and when I'm done eating if I'm focusing more on protein and fats. So
true. And it is, protein and fats are more satiating.
Right. Oh my God, absolutely.
Fiber too. So it makes sense to eat this way because you will feel more satiated. In fact, quite often I just eat one meal and I don't feel hungry the rest of the day. So I'm not going to force feed myself. So I just reduce my basal insulin. And of course, I won't be taking bolus insulin either. And my blood sugars remain all stable until I feel hungry again.
That's perfect. Yep. I do one meal a day a lot of days now too. And it's more for convenience than anything else. But I don't care if maybe on a Saturday I eat 2 or 3 meals. It's just for convenience, I might do one meal a day on all my clinic days because it's easier to and I'm not that hungry when I'm at work. If I'm busy running around clinic, I feel like I'm actually more effective and efficient when I'm in that fasted state. You know, it's hour 18 and 20 and 22. And I feel good. Like I feel lighter than right after eating, and I'm all bloated, and I feel better mentally too. Like my cognition feels better when I'm fasting. So it's helpful. I think one meal a day is great. And a lot of my patients do that too. I usually advise just trying to keep it in like a six-hour eating window every day, kind of the time restricted eating model. I don't get crazy with the multiple day fasting because I feel like you need really close follow-up for that. You know, you need like check-ins very regularly, and depending on comorbid conditions or medications that you take, I try to avoid even getting into that if not necessary.
Yeah, I alternate between 1 and 2 meals, but to fit in a third meal in there, no, I just wouldn't be able to. I mean, I can manage 2 meals. I alternate in the week. If I do 1 meal a day for 2-3 days in a row, then I switch to 2 meals, and it kind of works for me. But to force myself to eat yet another meal,
I know people are forcing themselves to eat 5 meals a day. Like, you know, dietitians say you should eat 5 meals a day to stimulate your metabolism. It's like, do you know what that does to your insulin and your glucose throughout the day? It's literally like this 5 separate times at least. And every little snack that you're having is also spiking glucose and spiking insulin. So the insulin can bring the glucose into your cells. I don't know. I think that whole like making yourself eat 5 meals a day is more theory than anything else. Like, I don't think it's been proven to actually be helpful. And it seems in my patients that 1 or 2 meals a day is the best.
I recently heard that the recommendation was it 90s, in the 90s, I think, 9 meals, eating 9 smaller meals, which is literally every 2 hours, putting something in my mouth. But looking back, I probably did that because I would feel hungry after an hour or 2 hours. Blood sugars are dropping, and I'm starting to feel hungry because blood sugars dropping, ghrelin is going up. So let's talk about all these other hormones and how they synchronize or work with insulin.
Yeah, one of the most important things that I go over with like every patient, because none of them have heard about hormones when it comes to weight gain, even though sometimes I think people are like, they blame hormones, but they're like not sure what they mean. Like they might be blaming estrogen, you know what I mean, because of menopause or something like that. But I like to go over how carbs and starches and sugars affect glucose, and then how the glucose spiking leads to an insulin release from your pancreas, and how insulin is the hormone that's released from the pancreas that is used to shuttle glucose into your cells for use for energy. However, our bodies don't really need glucose from the diet because we create our own sugar through gluconeogenesis in the liver, the breakdown of glycogen. So in fact, we talk about essential macronutrients as protein, fat, and carbs, but really carbs are kind of like that question mark, like, are they really an essential macronutrient? Like, do we really need to eat a certain number of carbs per day for bodily function? Probably not, because we will create our own sugar through that process of gluconeogenesis. But so insulin is an important one to discuss because, you know, the more insulin that's released over time, the more resistant your body gets to the effects of that insulin. And that's the, you know, the founding factor in insulin resistance and why our country is so metabolically unhealthy. It's something like 88% of people have some form of metabolic dysfunction, whether it's a comorbid condition linked to being overweight or one of the actual factors that is in the diagnosis of metabolic syndrome. There's something kind of off in 88% of this country, which is makes sense when you have, you know, a diet culture that surrounds low fat and calorie counting instead of carb restriction, although the trend does seem to be changing a little bit recently. And I think we're helping with that. And then, what was I going to say about, the other hormone that I always go over is ghrelin, which you mentioned, like the hunger hormone, because an hour or two after eating high carb, starchy, sugar kind of foods, if you're eating based on the food pyramid from like, you know, the 70s, you're going to have a ghrelin spike, which is the hunger hormone. And so all of these wild swinging hormones throughout the day, like I can picture a graph in my head of just like all of these hormones spiking and dipping are going to cause you to have crazy food seeking behavior, particularly the ghrelin, the hunger hormone.
Yeah, this is how food cravings come about. So people who are eating processed carbs especially are craving food all day long. I did. But
I
you
did too. I did too. And even like at my biggest, I was craving foods that weren't even really that bad. Like looking back, right? I kind of, when I first tried to diet, I wasn't losing weight doing this, but I was trying to pick like honey and apples and potatoes. And like, I was trying to do root vegetables or like more natural sources of sugar, but I was still eating a high quantity of all these foods, wheat bread, brown rice, quinoa, because it was still causing, it doesn't matter how much fiber there is in that stuff, it's still causing a glucose response, an insulin response, 2 hours later, a ghrelin response. So like I was still getting all of these crazy hormone fluctuations. And that's why I was like, what am I doing? I'm eating so healthy. I'm eating apples and bananas and quinoa and brown rice and wheat bread. And like, why am I still 306 pounds? And it's like, because even the foods that are widely regarded as healthy, if you just polled the audience, are still so high in sugar and cause such a high glucose hormonal response in the body.
Yeah, I know that as a type 1 diabetic, because I know I have to carb count. I have to count the carbs of everything I eat so I can match the insulin to it. Or that
How many carbs? Do you have a specific number per day that you do?
Right now, it's under 5. I mean, it's because the vegetables that I eat are just so low in carb anyway. They're the low carbohydrate vegetables. And because I'm eating them in smaller quantities and just focusing on protein. In fact, most of the insulin I take to cover my meals are for the protein itself rather than the carbohydrates. I completely ignore the carbohydrates. I don't even dose for the vegetables.
Yeah, you're at 5. You're talking about 5 grams total or 5%?
Total.
5 grams.
Total.
Oh my
total.
God, yeah, that's low.
I mean, wouldn't that up? So I don't even count the carbs. I just dose for the protein. But that's, I mean, for a type 1 diabetic, and I was shifting from what we started to talk about, but for a type 1 diabetic, that's a challenge because there is no formula about, how much insulin to take for the protein.
Right.
And so you have to learn. Unfortunately, people in my community, we have to learn through trial and error.
It is trial and error. I actually am like, it's so hard. So I think the hardest thing about having a type 1 diabetic patient is they've been told for 20, 30, 40, 50 years, I don't know when I'm going to meet them, it could be when they're 70, that they have to eat carbs. And like, for them more than anyone else, it's the hardest to give them up because they have associated that with like a necessity, like an absolute necessity. And usually when I have a type 1 diabetic person sitting in front of me, they have never tried or even thought about trying low carb. Whereas a lot of other patients come to see me and they're like, yeah, I did keto once. And I lost a lot of weight, but then I started eating carbs again and it all came back. It's like, that person is so easy to work with because it's like, you can pinpoint, of course you start eating carbs. That's your answer, right? Like you are, genetically incapable of eating carbs or you're going to gain all this weight. So it's like you can reason with them. But if someone has unfortunately been diagnosed with type 1 diabetes 50 years ago, it's so hard convincing them that carbs are part of the problem. They've been told from how many professionals, medical professionals, nurses, dietitians, personal trainers, they've been told for decades that they're supposed to eat carbs. So it's like, I'm the first one telling them maybe they should minimize them.
Yeah, I mean, this is why I created a Facebook group. It's a small, for the small, I think, a narrow community of type 1s specifically who do fasting, and not only intermittent, but some of us do extended fast as well, and keto. And I was surprised because now there are 300 members in the group and we're all doing the same thing. So the movement is growing. I think
I'm going to need that. I need that group.
Yeah, I'll invite you. I'll send you the link. I mean, we are learning from each other. We're supporting each other. But I think that what's sad about it is that it is us in the community who are supporting one another. And none of us is getting the support from our physicians or healthcare specialists.
It's so sad. This is why I'm not friends with many doctors. It's so sad.
We're having to figure things out, but it's also shocking when people send me private messages, so saying, So what do you eat at bedtime? And I'm thinking, why would I need to eat at bedtime? Because I have a low during the night. But so for 20 years, people have been told to eat cornstarch and milk and oats right at bedtime.
I
And
know.
it's shocking for me. It's actually sad. And they've got it ingrained in them because that's what they've been told for 20 years. That's what they're doing. And then, they go, well, but it doesn't seem to be working. Well, yeah, I'm still dropping low. But why are you dropping low? You're dropping low because your insulin is too high.
Yeah.
Why hasn't someone told them you're taking too much nighttime insulin? Just
Nighttime
reduce
insulin. Yeah, I know.
You need a snack. You don't need a snack.
I had a patient go from 120 units a day to 0 in 6 months. Like A1C 12.1 to 5.6, like to obviously type 2 diabetic. But immediately upon meeting an endocrinologist, he was told, oh, well, your A1C is 12. So you need to be on high doses of insulin right away. Whereas like, if I was meeting that person right away, I would be like, this is an emergency, but it's an emergency dietary intervention that we have to do. Like, why put someone on 120 units of insulin just to normalize it in the short term when that's going to do him no favors and he's just going to gain a ton more weight? I mean, it'll only do it's so short-sighted. It's like immediately your blood sugar will be lower, but what is this going to do 120 units a day long term to body weight and whatever else? Like it's just going to screw up his system even more. So yeah, type 2 is a little easier because when you meet the person, you can almost show them how it's possible. I use like other patients' data that's anonymous, and I'll show them how within 3 months, within 6 months, it's possible to cut their A1C in half. We need more data on type 1 just to show people, like to show them that it's possible. I think this group is going to be so important and transformative. I had no idea that it even existed. I'm like so excited to share this with my patients. I have a few who are type 1 and I will definitely send it to them. Anyone can join, right?
Anyone can join. I write blogs as well on fasting, extended fasting. Intermittent fasting is fine. Many diabetics do intermittent fasting because it just comes, but many diabetics type 1 diabetics who are on low carb, it comes naturally, intermittent fasting. Just don't eat first thing in the morning and eat your first meal at 11 or 12. It kind of comes naturally. Yeah. But extended fasting, I created the room. I was surprised how many people out there are doing extended fasts and benefiting from it. They feel good. They regain insulin sensitivity. I'm going to give this a go. First time I did it, it was a 90-hour fast. I recorded everything from ketone levels to how much insulin I was taking it. So I wrote a blog about that. And then I decided to go for 100 hours. So over 5 days, it's not full 5 days, but 100 hours. So again, I blogged about that too. And then many more people started joining the group. So I'm doing this too. I do it once a month, but I don't do it once a month. But I don't have weight issues. And I'm also quite I lift weights, etc. So I don't have that need. I'm very insulin sensitive as it is. So I don't have that motivation to do it more regularly than I do. Perhaps once a year is fine for me, just for autophagy and the other benefits of extended fasts. But people are doing it. So
I guess I should say it's not something that I'm against. It's more the patient population that I work with. So I work with quite a socioeconomically disadvantaged group, and I'm scared with, a lot of comorbidities, and I'm scared to suggest something like that without very close follow-up. I usually do 4, 6, or 8 week follow-up. And so it's like not a feasible recommendation. I think someone in your situation with like your knowledge and background and like just scientific knowledge in general, in career choice and everything else, your hobbies, like you're going to be a lot more knowledgeable and health literate than some of the other people. So I don't know. I think I look into it and I like definitely consider it. For me, it's like what's easier for people to do. And time restricted eating is just like so easy to incorporate. It's like the easiest thing. The first time I meet someone, I can start them on a plan that's like, okay, just eat between these 2 hours. And the only way you can't do it is if you're used to eating carbs all day because you're craving them. You wake up like starving. Like even just if you have a day where you cheat, you notice like you wake up the next morning ravenous. Like all you want is pancakes the following morning after cheating, because your body is like, give me more of those carbs right away.
Also, I think craving increases when you're stressed.
Oh my God.
I don't know the mechanism. Yeah, if you haven't had a good sleep, you wake up craving food in the mornings.
I don't know if the mechanism is fully fleshed out, but they do know that third shift workers do have higher ghrelin. So it's probably some excess cortisol from stress, and then an excess ghrelin release from being like awake overnight or having shortened sleep cycles. Mm-hmm. There's like an increase in your hunger hormone. So a lot of this is like not our fault. It's just a biological process that's happening, and it takes over your brain where you're not even making these like intellectual decisions. It's almost like a drive, like an animal that you can't help.
And this is why having the willpower to restrict your calories, or to only have one potato instead of two and going hungry all day long, well, that is not sustainable. You cannot have the willpower to sustain that kind of diet. This is what
I think right. I think when people hear like my story, they think, wow, like I'll never have willpower like that, right? Like my motivating factor was like my sister dying. That is not happening to me. So that will not, I'll never have the motivation you had, or the inspiration you had, or like the willpower. But it wasn't just that. That was just like the inciting situation that I was in. And then once I got rid of all those toxic foods that I was addicted to, it was way easier to stay on track. And at this point, I just cheat once or twice a year. And it's usually related to some kind of life stressor. Like it's a binge or an emotional response to something that I like can't help, or that I just kind of like give up for a day or something like that. And I think we have to like normalize that as part of this process, because we're all just humans who make mistakes. And it's like so important to forgive yourself during like your weight loss journey.
True. And if you fall off the wagon, just pick yourself back up again. It's not the end of the world, you know? Because I hear it, people say, okay, well, I messed it up yesterday, it was birthday, whatever. And what do I do now? Well, what do you do? Just start again.
No, I'll just start on Monday. I'll just start after my vacation. Actually, you know what? I have that wedding in 2 weeks. I'm just going to start August 1st. I think it's better if I, like, literally you could explain it for hours.
This is what happens, I think, if you just leave it for too long to start again. If you pick yourself back up,
it should be immediately. Immediately.
Exactly.
The same day. Because it can't be later in that day. You'll just be like, well, this morning I screwed up, so I'm just gonna, like, you'll always convince yourself. So it has to be in that moment. You're already committed to the next meal being healthy.
Yeah. Well, we talked about intermittent fasting, but I know, for example, type 1s, or a lot of type 1s don't do anything more than 12 hours of intermittent fasting. They wake up in the morning, they have their, 3 eggs, 3 eggs for breakfast, and then maintaining perfect blood sugar. So I think if you're eating this way, you might not even, need to do fasting for longer than 12 or 14 hours, which is easy to do for most. So I know type 1s who just have 3 square meals a day, and they're happy, they're healthy, their blood sugars are normal.
Yep. I do like your idea of like a once a year kind of reset for autophagy. That's kind of smart. I think that's a good idea. I mean, I wish there was like a study on this kind of stuff, because then we could prove like once or twice a year, 3 to 5 day fast would be like a beneficial intervention for people. But I've never even gotten into it myself. I've never fasted for more than 48 hours. So I'll have to experiment with it a little bit. I feel like I'm stable now, like having reversed all of those, the type 2 diabetes and the blood pressure. And I mean, all of those things are gone and all my labs look good. So it's probably time for me to try some things out of the box.
I think it's less challenging if you're not on any medication.
Yes, exactly.
Once it's, you have to be prepared to have a CGM. Extremely important, to alert you, especially through the night, if you're having a low or a high. And also you have to be prepared to adjust your insulin.
Yeah, that's right. I think you've talked about this in a prior episode about your CGM and having someone tell you that you're like privileged to have one, right? It was like a dietitian.
It actually wasn't about the CGM. It was about my insulin pump. They said,
your pump.
because in the UK, you see, it's all under our National Health Service. So I was given the pump without having to pay for it myself. So they said, well, you are one of the privileged few who've been selected to have a pump. Now you've got to prove to us that our selection was right, that we made a good choice by giving the limited number of pumps that obviously the system can support. You have to prove to us, you have to reduce your A1C, and no matter what I did, just couldn't get there. And one of the, you mentioned this, that this is something that you did as well. One of the first few things that I did was replacing white sucrose, for example, white sugar, with honey.
Yep.
I would buy expensive honey, replacing white flour with the best quality that I could get. I'd order it online. Whole wheat flour, making bread at home every single morning. But again, I mean, that kind of cleans up the diet. But as far as my blood sugars were concerned, it made absolutely no difference.
It's just not enough. But those are all the default interventions that you hear. Like the diabetic diet is like switch to wheat for everything.
Yeah. Whole wheat. Yeah, whole wheat.
Yeah, whole wheat and brown rice and quinoa, and, you know, eat your oatmeal. And I can just see all the spikes in blood sugar in my head throughout the whole day.
It's crazy because it makes no difference to your, it doesn't even bring your A1C down.
It's crazy when I tell patients that I don't think oatmeal is like a better choice than Lucky Charms. I tell them that and they're like, what do you mean? And I'm like, oatmeal is just going to spike your blood sugar. Like, it's not even worth your time. Don't even bother with it. Like, eat eggs. Like, skip the oatmeal.
And bacon and eggs.
Yes, eat bacon and eggs. They're like, what do you mean that's better than oatmeal? You sound crazy. I'm like, okay, maybe I sound crazy, but I'm your weight loss doctor and I'm telling you to eat bacon and eggs instead of oatmeal.
True. Well, we covered quite a lot. I think on one of your websites or one of the sites about you mentioned bariatrics. So is that something you get involved in? Do any of your patients, for example, undergo any sort of weight loss surgery?
Somebody might have just said bariatrics because the department that I work in is the bariatric department. And so we work alongside the surgeons because there is such a high weight regain that happens after surgery with anybody, you know, regardless of surgeon, regardless of where you go, regardless of the surgery that you get, whether it's like a Roux-en-Y or a gastric sleeve, there's weight regain. And a lot of that has to do with nutrition because you have this tiny little stomach. And even if you have, you know, pizza and cereal and cookies and you know, crackers, you might get nauseous if you try to overeat or have dumping syndrome or have like these adverse reactions to eating too much. So your calories naturally go down, maybe your total carb count naturally goes down and the weight comes off because of all of the, you know, hormonal improvements that come with gastric bypass. But then 18 to 24 months after the surgery, your hormones start to shift back in the other direction. You might have some, you know, expansion in the size of your belly. And if none of your dietary habits have really changed, like if your nutrition hasn't changed overall very much, then weight might start to come back on. And so working alongside bariatric surgeons is actually really helpful. It helps the patients who underwent this huge procedure only to backtrack 18 or 24 months later. So I do see a lot of post-op bariatric patients, try to help them get the weight off again. And I end up teaching them something that they had never learned to begin with.
Mm-hmm. So, and with these surgeries, how about nutritional deficiencies with these surgeries? Because that's another common thing, because nutrition isn't fully absorbed.
It's true. The sleeve is the most common like gastric surgery these days, and the nutritional deficiencies are not as bad or severe as like you know, the Roux-en-Y, which was the procedure from 10 to 20 years ago that was most popular. So they happen. They're not as bad. People are mostly on like multivitamins. They have to be sure to supplement like the fat soluble vitamins and make sure that they have kind of a robust dietary plan that includes lots of vegetables if they want to avoid supplementation, but supplementation is advised for basically every patient. And yeah, working with that is important too, because we kind of have to keep an eye on vitamin levels over time, in addition to counseling them on dietary changes. I do also prescribe weight loss medications. So I'll often use drugs like metformin, which is a diabetes drug, to help lower insulin levels and decrease some of the cravings, decrease blood sugar. And then there are the newer GLP-1 agonist medications, the injectables. And honestly, a lot of patients who have undergone bariatric surgery are extremely interested in weight loss medications. That seems to be my most popular crowd when it comes to like that desire for medication. And I think it's like, you know, it's people who went through something major and now they like need another major intervention, and they can't go back to surgery. So they want something like prescribed for the weight loss. But at the end of the day, I always make sure to counsel people on nutrition, because that's the most important part. There's no magic pill or shot that will just like make you eat whatever you want and lose 25% of your body weight. Like if that existed, I would be on it.
Or the slimming juices, and drink this juice instead of food for a week. And
if only, right?
It all comes back.
I know. If only that existed. I wish it did.
Mm-hmm. But I think generally people look for that magic pill for everything, not just weight loss, but my blood pressure is high, my blood sugars are high, give me the magic pill, and everything will be better. Dr. Gendreau, it was absolutely amazing having you with us today. I enjoyed every minute of our conversation.
Me too. It was wonderful. Thank you. I love, any opportunity to share my story. Loved hearing your story. Thank you so much for the resources for the type 1 diabetic patients that I have. I think they'll really appreciate it. And I'll probably direct them to this YouTube video as well.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And but before we go, why don't you tell our audience how they can find you and where they can support you on social media?
Sure. So my Instagram is at Kevin Gendreau, KevinGendreau. My Twitter handle and my TikTok handle are actually the same. So just at Kevin Gendreau. My website is kevingendreau.com. And then my book is Fasting While Furious, How I Turned Anger and Sadness into Motivation for Weight Loss. And that's on Amazon.
Perfect. I'll put all the links below. So thank you so much once again. Have a good day.
Thank you. Thank you. Take care.